I was born in Torrington, Connecticut in 1936, September 18th, in the Charlotte Hungerford Hospital. And Torrington is in the western part of the state of Connecticut, which is in Litchfield County. My mother lived on a dairy farm in Goshen, Connecticut, which is up the hill, or the mountain. They're not mountains back in the east, but they're up the hill from Torrington, where they had pretty severe winters. It was different than Hartford, where I grew up after we got going. Soon after birth, I lived in New York City for, I don't know exactly how long, but a year or more, while my father was interning with my grandfather. My father was trying to become a CPA, an accountant, and my grandfather had been a certified public accountant in the state of New York since about 1905. My grandfather graduated from Yale in 1903, and the Mount Herman School in Massachusetts, up near where Jennifer comes from. He was there he played football there, and he was in the banjo club and all those things at Mount Herman. He did the same things at Yale, and he sang his way through Yale. He gave concerts as a tenor. My father went to Phillips Academy in Andover, Mass., the same prep school I went to, and my father was in the class of 1929 at Andover and the class of 1935 at Yale, so it took him a little longer to get his degree from Yale University. And he became a certified public accountant, and I can remember him studying for it in the early 1940s, just before the Second World War, because I was 5 when the Second World War broke out. But by that time, we were living in West Hartford, Connecticut. We moved in there from the Goshen area, and my father was working for an accounting firm in Hartford called Canoost, Everett, and Cambria. And he worked for them for quite a number of years, I grew up in West Hartford, and soon after 1939, I must have still been living out in the Goshen area, because my sister Jane was born in 1939, and my sister Alice and my brother Peter. Alice was born in 1944, and my brother was born in 1945, and they were born in the Hartford Hospital. So we were living in Hartford. I can remember we were living in West Hartford when the Second World War broke out, and I can remember that distinctly starting. Well, it's quite interesting, because what we learned as kids was that the whole country was in the war effort. We had what are called victory gardens. Any place there was an open field or an open corner on a street, you had gardens planted, and everybody in the neighborhood and families were in there weeding. It was a community effort, and everything was saved. Newspapers were saved. I can remember the foil off a piece of gum was saved. You had these balls of tin foil that were saved for the war effort. And we lived in a place where there was a major effort in the war going on, because Pratt & Whitney aircraft, which made jet engines at the time, and Sikorsky helicopters, and the command propeller company in the Hartford area all had major efforts. So the factories were really busy in the state of Connecticut. And for a kid, I started in scouting when I was, I guess, about 8, so it would have been 1944. We started wearing Cub Scout uniforms, and after that, when it came time for Boy Scouts, uniforms were really a great thing for a young person, because we'd watch everybody in uniform throughout the Second World War, and you go to the movies, and if you went to the Saturday morning movies, there'd always be the movie tone news showing the battles that had occurred during the week, and so everybody was knew about the war. Even though I was young, you were influenced by what was going on. I can remember the stars going up in some of the windows of the houses nearby where people had lost a child. We had one that we lived at. We first lived on the boulevard, and then we moved to Brace Road, 84 Brace Road. And the Waits, I remember their name is W-A-I-T-E, lived just across the corner from us. And I remember when they lost one of their son, person I'd seen around the home, lost him during the Second World War, and that was when I was probably around seven or eight, and that stuck with me when that star went up. And my best friend, the one who eventually became my best man, and I was his best man in our weddings, was named Dick Finch, and his father was in the Navy. His father was on board ship when they landed at Iwo Jima, so he was right in the midst of it. So, and Dick was an only child, and we had more than we needed in our family. Well, we had two when the war started, and by the end of the Second World War, I had another sister and a brother who were very young and had none of the influence of the Second World War on them. But the war, for a young kid, it was talked about in the school, and we used to walk to school in the mornings. You know, everybody walked all over. We didn't have school buses. Well, we may have, but they certainly weren't very many of them, maybe one for the whole school district. But as we walked to school, we had a little ditty that we sang, and it was a whistle while you work, Hitler is a jerk, Mussolini is a meanie, but the Japs are worse. And that was the way you grew up. And so you can imagine what it was like with these, you now see the movies and how the Japanese, who were citizens of this country at the time, were put in these camps and really mistreated by everybody around them, because they were just as much Americans as the rest of us who were born here. But that's the way it was. So you generated some biases pretty early in life. They didn't happen to stick with me for very long, because being somewhat of an athlete, I was playing sports with everybody and his brother, you know, so you got to know everybody and you became friends. And as kids, there was less of it, but that type of song generated the prejudice that existed during the Second World War. And it was pretty bad for the adults. I mean, they got, you know, kept from doing things if they were Germans or Japanese or Italians. And yet the major factory workers and the people in this country, in the United States, the Italians, got less of it, I think, than the Japanese and the Germans. But people were not very happy with them during that period of time. Well, we did anything that you could do outdoors, and we did it on our own. We didn't have much in the way of organized things. We didn't have Little League, for instance, in baseball, but we'd put a hoop up on the back or side of a building and put boards down to keep the mud from, you know, the mud, when it would rain, and you'd take shots at the hoop and the mud would come up between the boards, or it would get all over the ball, and of course it would grind the mud into your hands, and you'd go in the house and you could see your lines of your fingers where the mud would get right in your grooves of your fingerprints. So we played basketball outdoors, you know, until somebody called us, and we'd go out in the morning and find some friends, and we played war. I mean, anytime there was an open lot, we'd probably have foxholes, and I got a couple of cuts over my eye where I was hit by rocks. The guys were friends on the other side were throwing rocks at you. It was part of the war games that were being carried on there. You know, they hadn't made helmets at that point. In fact, our football helmets were really pretty thin pieces of leather, and the same thing was. I was playing ice hockey in the early '50s, and it was the first time we'd ever seen a helmet. We had a guy on the team who was epileptic, and he fell on the ice one day and hit his head and had a fit. And after that, we were all required to wear a helmet for ice hockey. And that was about 52 or 53, and that's the National Hockey League. Nobody had a helmet, including the goalies. So the goalies would have hundreds of stitches on their face in the NHL. These terrific goalies, because they kept getting cut with pucks, and they'd take them off the ice, go in and stitch them up, and put them back out on the ice. So it was a different time then. Things were done differently, and but we had a lot of fun growing up. And we didn't have an awful lot. Nobody had excess money. We had rationing during the Second World War. I can remember these little stickers that we put in the book so you could get butter or gasoline, or I forget what all of the things were, but sugar was another one. And our meals were, certainly weren't as many things on the shelves of the grocery stores as there are now. You made do with what was available. And because the majority of all the effort went into the war effort in this country. Savings bonds, they got us to put, we'd put 5 cents a week. We'd teach you how to save and buy these little booklets that would give you $25 savings bonds for the war effort. I don't think we had any fear or anxiety. We felt that we were protected, that going to school every day, nobody was worried that, we did have bomb shelters and we did have air raid warnings periodically, and they run through the tests every once in a while. The sirens would go off and you were supposed to run and hide, and all those types of things. But the closest we came, on the East Coast there were German submarines along Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and along the eastern seaboard, and they actually supposedly landed a couple of places, but they never attacked anybody or came on shore with guns, and because people were prepared. They had these lookouts on the South Beach side of Martha's Vineyard Island. They had these cement places with gun mounts in case the Germans did land on the shore. At one point I worked with a man named Fraser Barney Wild Jr., and he was on yawls off the coast of New England during the Second World War, which had wooden hulls and were less susceptible to the sonar from the submarines. It was in the infancy of sonar, and his job out there was to look for German subs, and he did that. And I remember I was crewing on a 41-foot sloop. I lived on one for one summer and took care of it for his father, Fraser Barney Wild Sr., who was president of Connecticut General Life Insurance, and I was his crew and took care of the boat. And the boat would be kept in Essex, Connecticut. And when it was time to sail it down to Maine, I went with, they called him Squeak, was his son's name, and I would go with Squeak and we'd sail it. And what he would do is, and his father was very cautious about everything, and his son had sailed in these yawls in the worst weather imaginable, and so he was a real good sailor, and throw caution to the wind was his idea. And he'd take off and we'd leave Essex and we'd just head right straight out to sea. We wouldn't go along the coast so we'd be near a place to come into a port or anything else. He'd just head way out to sea. And when he finally decided, he said, well, I guess we better head north now so we can get to Booth Bay Harbor. And we were in East Booth Bay Harbor where we moored the boat. And we'd go out there and he'd put as much sail as he possibly could on the boat, and we'd be just heeled way over, and I was having a ball because at that age I figured nothing would happen to me, and his father really disliked him because he just didn't take any caution about anything, but he lasted throughout the full Second World War on these yawls that they used to look for the subs. So school, you asked about school. School classrooms were, I guess we had about 30 in a class most of the time. Great teachers, very dedicated teachers who'd been there for years. Once in a while you get a new teacher, but it was a place to just have fun and try to learn something, I guess. There wasn't an awful lot of emphasis on things other than if you didn't do well on your report card and you brought it home, you got in trouble. They graded on the basis of I think it was A, B, C, it was outstanding, above average, fair, I forget, good, poor, needs work or something. I started out, I loved ice hockey. I learned to skate. I loved to ski and skate. I've got a picture of me on skis when I'm about 2 years old in 1938. But I had, at the end of the Second World War, I bought some wooden World War II white surplus skis from the ski corps, or whatever they called the ski guys, and would hitchhike to Mohawk Mountain, which was out past Goshen, where my mother grew up, and where there were taller hills, and they had rope tows there, so I learned to ski really quite young. And I learned to skate young, and so I loved to play ice hockey, and we'd play on any place we could clear the ice, we'd play ice hockey. And then I went in 1950, a couple of things happened to me in 1950. I went to Valley Forge in the Boy Scout Jamboree. I was a cook for the for Troop 6 in West Hartford that I'd been in, where we had about 50 scouts in a troop and 4 patrols and, you know, junior assistant scout, the full program where everybody wore a uniform every week, and you were on a waiting list to get in a troop. And so the troops they had the full patrol system and all of the things that scouting had started out as. But I was a scout, I was a cub and then a scout, and really enjoyed scouting. Loved the camp outs, and we'd camp out usually once a month, and you know, really, actually, you know, would ditch our tents and would dig latrines and all the things that they don't let you do anymore. But I enjoyed scouting, and went to Valley Forge for a big jamboree there in 1950. And the day we came home from the Camp Pioneer in Winston, Connecticut, where we were training to go to Valley Forge, the Korean War broke out. We got home, and here was a thing on the newspaper that the Korean War was breaking out, and we were all in uniform, and also we figured we're going right to Korea. You know, we're 13, 14 years old, and we you know, lived during the Second World War, so we're ready to go. We think we're probably trained well enough and everything. You know, as a kid that age, you have your whatever you call it, your imagination runs away with you. So. We didn't, but that year I went to as a day student to a place called the Loomis School in Windsor, Connecticut. I wanted to go there. My father wanted me to go there 1 year to prepare to try to go to Andover, where he'd gone, and my grades weren't the greatest, but so it was kind of a preparatory year. And I went to Loomis, and I played. I was a catcher. I played baseball. And on the baseball team, during the winter, we played ice hockey on the Connecticut River, but the river, in a certain place at the edge of the river, and if the ice wasn't thick enough, we had to move the boards off the ice and keep them on the side until the ice got thicker. So we were on and off the ice all the time, so we didn't play many hockey games. And I was asked by the baseball coach if I would go to the gym on the basketball court and catch a pitcher named Mo Drabowski. And Mo Drabowski wound up going and pitching for, I don't know how many years for the Chicago Cubs, but he was pitching for Loomis, and of course he won an awful lot of games there for Loomis. But I spent one winter just catching him pretty much every day. We'd go over there and catch in the afternoon, and it was great for me because he threw the ball pretty hard, and I was fairly young. I was about 14 when I caught him for, you know, so it was a good start. And then the next year I went and took the entrance exams at Andover, and I'd taken Latin at Loomis, and we'd gone 55 lessons in a book called Pearson's Essentials of Latin, and I went to take the test at Andover, and they had gone 65 lessons in this book. So I'd never been introduced to 10 of the chapters in there. So I didn't do well on they placed me in my freshman year in pretty much everything, as opposed to going in as a sophomore. But they placed me in my sophomore year English. You know, so I took this English class, and I had a new teacher named Campbell. He'd just come to Andover. He wasn't one of the guys that had been there for 20 years, one of the teachers that had been there for a long time, or had tenure, or whatever you want to refer to it as. And it was an all-private boys' school where we wore a coat and a tie to class every day and lived in dormitories, and it was about 100 miles from where I lived, or 100 and so miles from Hartford, just to the northwest of Boston, Phillips Academy in Andover, Mass. And so I had second year English from him, and he came to me one day and he said, "You're pretty much at Andover it was your junior, lower middler, upper middler, and then a senior. It's like, you know, the same as freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior." And he said, "It's my first year here, and it probably would look good on my record if I flunked somebody for English too." I wasn't too good in Shakespeare anyway, but or any of those, mainly because they built a hockey rink there. It was the first prep school hockey rink in New England, and it was in 1951 And it was when they built the rink, and Tenley Albright, the Olympic figure skater, came out to Andover to practice. And that rink was open. We didn't have a roof on it or anything. And my seat in the English class, I could look down and watch her skate. So I didn't spend much time paying attention to the essentials of Shakespeare or whatever. But so I was held back, and it took me 4 years to go through Andover after having already had a freshman year. But I played.
Did you ever get a date with the skater?
No, she was quite a bit older, and I was fairly shy at the time, particularly around girls. At any rate, I played football that fall. They had 6-man football, and believe it or not, I got thrown off the 6-man football because I was too rough. I was a center. And in 6-man football, I was eligible for a pass, to receive a pass. So I'd take a couple of steps out, and the guy'd flip the ball to me, and I would run over guys. I'd try to run right through them, because I really loved to play sports. I wasn't that good, but I was rough. And so they had a German guy who was had played soccer in Germany, Mr. Lohnes, Lohnes, anyway. He didn't like me. He says, "You're too rough, you're going to hurt somebody." So they cut me. They threw me off the 6-man football. We had 4 clubs there, the Gauls, the Saxons, there are 4 Latin, Greeks, and I can't remember the 4th one. I was a Gaul, and the Gaul 6-man football team. And we had 4 different colors, Saxons, Greeks, Gauls. Anyway, I've forgotten the 4th one. I stopped playing that, and they sent me to the JV football team. And so I went to this, which was a JV football team for some of the larger freshmen, juniors or freshmen, and then the sophomores that weren't playing on the varsity team. They had a JV B team, which was the one for the freshmen and sophomores, a JV A team for the juniors and seniors, and then a regular varsity football team of the really good players. And I was on the JV B team, and I played linebacker and center, and I played pretty well. I wasn't too bad. I wasn't afraid of anything. I'd love to play defense, and I wasn't eligible for a pass in that, so all I did was center the ball. But anyway, I played that, and I played ice hockey. I was on a freshman line on the varsity ice hockey team because freshmen couldn't play, but there were 3 of us who were really good skaters and had played hockey, and they wanted to bring us forward as a line for the coming years. So I played ice hockey that first year with the varsity, and then I played baseball on the freshman baseball team. They had a regular freshman team. We played other teams, and I was a catcher and wound up being the most valuable player as a freshman. And about during the spring, they posted the people that they wanted to come back for football in August for early season football for the varsity, and my name wasn't on the list. And I'd played pretty well on the JVB, and I figured, well, I'll at least get invited back to this. So I went into the athletic director and I said, "How come my name's not on this?" "Oh, we're not going to let you play football anymore." He said, "You're not smart enough to do 3 sports. First of all, you'll flunk out of the school, and we want you to play ice hockey and baseball. You're a better size for those sports." So that ended my football career. And I did the next year, my sophomore year, I spent clearing, and for 3 years, I should have run cross country, but I was too fat and too slow to run cross country. But I spent the next 3 years clearing and ski trails with an axe and saws and just doing that stuff. And we had a big hurricane, and we had a national state forest there, the Parker State Forest, and they had this big hurricane, and we spent that fall clearing trees and off of roads and trails, and it was a lot of fun. Andover was a great school. Right now, looking back on it, mostly that I didn't study hard enough. I got by. I didn't really try to excel in academics ever, even at the Naval Academy. But I made it through Andover, which is a very, very tough school to get through. When I graduated from Andover in 1955, 96 of my classmates went to Yale, 54 went to Harvard, over 20 went to Princeton. I don't know how many went to Stanford, but it was a prep school. It's the Phillips Academy in Andover, Mass, and Phillips Exeter Academy are the two oldest prep schools in the United States. They're older than the state of Utah. That's how old they are. And they're heavily, heavily endowed. They're almost as heavily endowed as Yale is. So you know that they have a lot of bread coming in. One guy just actually gave a building here. I got an announcement the other day. Oscar Tang, he was 1 year behind me, and he was a really successful investor in New York City. He just gave $15 million to the school to establish I think it's a political science building there. So that's the kind of thing that happens at that school. Our first television was like 1952 in our house. I think that's when it was. Whenever the presidential election was either 50 or 52 or 54. 52, I think, I'm not sure. Well, it was Dewey and Truman, and my parents were, real dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, and nobody was going to beat Truman. I mean, nobody could beat Dewey. Yeah. Well, I was there when nobody could believe that Dewey was defeated. Yeah. And it turns out that, at least my estimation, one of the best presidents we've had in my lifetime, in retrospect, was Harry S. Truman. Yeah. He one of the finest guys we ever had. And anyway, I won't say too much about it, but if we had better people like him in there, we'd be in a whole lot better off these days, in my opinion anyway. Well, I got an appointment to the United States Naval Academy in 1955, and at the time we lived very close to, what happened is this. I was playing ice hockey, and I played at Andover, at Phillips Academy, they call it Andover. And our captain from my junior year in Andover was a Michael Harvey, Thomas Michael Harvey. He went to West Point, and he went on to be a general. And he and I actually were proctors in a freshman dormitory, so he was kind of like a roommate my junior year. And when he got to West Point, he called us back at Andover. This coach there named Riley said, can you get any other guys from Andover? Because he was the best hockey player they'd had at West Point for years. And he said, could you get any of your other guys? So they invited any of us that wanted to. Most of everybody was going to go to Yale. And that's where I assumed I was going to go, to either play baseball or hockey. But he invited us over, and we practiced for a weekend with the plebe team at West Point. And at the end of the weekend, the coach said, now you guys, we'd love to help you get an appointment to come here to play hockey for us. We can help you. We know how to get a hold of some congressmen and people like that if you'd like to. So I went back to Andover. My parents didn't know I'd gone over to West Point for the weekend. I got back there and called my father on the phone and said, Dad, I'm thinking of going to one of the service academies. And I hardly got it out of my mouth when, knowing that I was the oldest and he had how much college cost, and it was going to be tough for him to afford to send me to college if I didn't get a scholarship of some sort. He said, oh, your grandmother would be so happy. You know, your great-grandfather graduated from the Naval Academy. Your Uncle Alf graduated from the Naval Academy. You've got so much tradition in the Navy, it's unbelievable. Your grandmother will really be so happy. I said, I'm thinking of going to West Point. Oh, no, you're not. There's no way you're going there. That'll kill your grandmother. Nope. And I'm going to call Tom Dodd, Christopher Dodd's father, who lived 2 houses from us. We all grew up in a high-volume neighborhood. They had 7 children, I think, and lived just, if we went through our driveway and the people behind us across the street where Thomas Dodd was a senator from Connecticut for years and was on the Nuremberg trials. And my father called him and he said, oh, I'd love to appoint Billy, because I played basketball with Chris and Jerry, some of his children, knew all his children. I'd love to appoint him to the Naval Academy. Well, my father was Republican, Dodd was Democrat. So when it came, crunch time came, I got a telegram from Thomas Dodd and said, you're going to need to take the civil service exam. So one Saturday morning, I went over to Lawrence, Massachusetts, and in the post office, sat down, took the civil service exams. And the civil service exams were, if you can buy 2 oranges for 5 cents, how many can you buy for 10 cents? And it were things like that. And they were a lot of true and false and multiple choice, mostly multiple guess, or as they called it when in my day, or multiple choice. And I did very well on them. I stood second in the state of Connecticut, and the other guy who was trying to get an appointment lived in a different district. So he got an appointment from a different guy, and it justified Thomas Dodd's appointment of appointing me. So it was, that got me to the Naval Academy, and that's a rough 4 years. You're marching, you're in full uniform every day. I was sworn in my first day. They raised your arm to the square and they said, you're now an officer and a gentleman by an act of Congress. You have to swear to all the things to support the Congress of the United States and all the rest of the things that go with becoming coming in any form of the part of the military. You have that commitment to make. And then we went back to our rooms as a plebe, and a guy, our company commander, who had been who'd graduated the year before, he was an ensign, and he was there to help train us that summer, which was probably as tough a thing. And it's a whole 2 months worth of boot camp, really. It was in Maryland, and unbelievable humidity and white service uniforms that would never dry and would mildew, and you had to carry your M1 rifles, and they would wear on your uniform, and so you always were getting put on report for your uniform being dirty, and it just put you through a lot of hassle. But he stood and told us that we were all felt pretty good. We'd just been made an officer and a gentleman by an act of Congress, but he said, I'm going to tell you the truth. He said, you're a plebe at the United States Naval Academy, and you rate lower than the admiral's dog. That's where they placed you in terms of the hierarchy. You're lower than the admiral's dog, and it all flows downhill. So that's what the first year was like. They hassled you all day long at the tables. You had to sit up and eat on the edge of your chair and eat a square meal. You know, you'd sit right on the edge of the chair, and you had to eat your meal like this. It was they just harassed you all day long. And but I made it through. I didn't do very well. I did pretty well academically the first year, and the second year a little less, because I was playing both squash, varsity squash, and playing baseball. I was a top catcher on the plebe team, and then I went right on to varsity after that. But I didn't pay attention academically. Then in my third year, my what they call second class year. It's fourth class, third class, second class, first class. We were in Louisiana for spring training, and I went to chase a pop-up and twisted my back, and I wound up having a real serious problem with one leg, and it turned out that I'd torn some sections of cartilage in my spine, and they sent me to Bethesda, and I wound up at Bethesda Hospital, and they found out that I was missing some bone segments in my lower back from birth. They call it spina bifida, which people see a lot of, but the pictures of the spina bifida children that you generally see were far worse off than I was. I just had a couple of a couple of sections of L4 and L3 and L4 for me were missing and hadn't knitted properly or hadn't made properly. That's what spina bifida means, the healing of it or knitting of it. And so they gave me some exercises, but they also told me that I was going to get a medical discharge when I graduated. So when I graduated from the academy, I didn't get a commission. There were 7 of us in my class. One of them was a fellow named Bob Reef-Snyder, who was an All-American tackle in football, and he went to play for the LA Rams. And I was considered physically disqualified, and in my lifetime, I've managed to run 45 marathons and some pretty long ones, and I was still playing semi-professional baseball at age 62, and I played ice hockey. My last ice hockey game was at age 50, and I played squash most of my life, so I have ruined my lower body by all these things, and have had back operations and knee operations, and those various things that were all my own doing. I've never thought that I had a bad deal. I mean, I abuse my body and I get what I deserve. I guess I was more lived for the day at the time. When I was younger, I had a major life change when I was 31, but I'll cover that in a minute. But up till that point, I just played life as hard as I could. I worked very hard. I became an engineer, and I it was nothing to work 16-hour days. I enjoyed it. I thought that's the way you got ahead, was to just really work hard. I was not an 8-to-5 person, never an 8-to-5 person. I always got up very early in the morning, went to work early, and just put in more hours than everybody else. And as a result, I learned more. I started out in a machine shop as a sales engineer for a company that made rotor head assemblies and gearboxes for Sikorsky helicopters. And I realized that I didn't know enough about the machining industry. So I took a job as a machinist and learned. I went in on the weekends to that company and was taught by tool makers how to operate all the different machine tools, and really enjoyed it. And for about 3 or 4 years, I was involved in those types of mechanical engineering types of things. And I switched into instrumentation and controls in about 1965 and got in on the ground floor of computers. So my employment life was extremely varied, but very interesting, and very good for a person like me who has so many interests and wants to try everything, is open to a change, a lot of change in my life, very likely because I might have been what they now call ADD, adult deficit, whatever it is, the thing that, disorder, you know, just have too many interests in life. And that's what has always been my life purpose, is to try as many things, try to do anything I can, and have the attitude that you really can learn anything you try to learn. Well, I wouldn't be a biochemist or someone like that because I was not all that good in chemistry, although I taught it for 1 year. But there's certain things that it doesn't stick with you easily. Well, I say with an open mind. My own ideas with an open mind. Now, in terms of what they could do with their lives, that they shouldn't be limited. We've all been put here on the earth with a pretty good system inside our head. And if you want to apply it and put hard work together with your brain power that you've inherently been given, you can do about anything you try to do. Or at least you ought to be willing to try things and work hard at them. There are different philosophies. Some people decide early in life what to do, and it appears to me as I look at other people that those who've decided to be a doctor and have been a doctor for 30 or 40 years probably have added more to the society than I have. They've maybe been more successful financially. I never held wealth as a goal for me. And it seems as I look back in my family over the generations, that has never been a goal of our family. Nobody's back there in my direct Whittlesey lineage has ever been very wealthy. Plenty of relatives have been, but never put their mind on that. So it's more living and getting along with people. My parents had many, many friends, so we grew up, it was one of those things where you befriended anybody you could and took everybody on face value. There's probably some biases that I had early in life, but the changing point in my life occurred in 1968 when the LDS missionaries came to our house out in New Hampshire. We lived on a dirt road 2.5 miles outside of a town that had 400 people in it. And you wonder why the missionaries would come to our door. Well, a man in the hardware store in Peterborough, New Hampshire, we lived in Hancock, about 15 miles to the north of Peterborough, had mentioned that there was a new couple living in Hancock, and it looked like they might make nice members of the LDS Church. So these missionaries came out. One of them was from East Mill Creek, a fellow named Gary Bruce Cahoon. And they knocked on the door, and my wife was there, and she thought they were from the local Congregational church, which was a big old New England white church right in the center of town. Said, "Come in, I want to hear all about your church." And of course, they probably jaws dropped, and I was in fact, that day I was in Millinocket, Maine, and I called home which was a long ways away, about 300 miles away from where we lived, and in a paper mill. And when I spoke to her that night, she said, "Well, I've had two of the nicest young men to come to us, and I'd like you to come home and meet them. I've invited them to be over for dinner Friday night." And I said, "Well, I'll do my best, but I'm going to be quite a ways from home, and whether I get home in time or not, I don't know." I didn't get home till about 11 that night from another paper mill I'd been at, and so they came back another day later, and after a month, we were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and it totally changed my life. I drank too much before that. I didn't have very good control. I didn't drink a lot, but when I drank far too much, and I didn't concentrate very much on family. I thought I was a good father, and I certainly loved my wife and loved my children, but I was a pretty selfish individual, I have a feeling. I did most everything for my own benefit, more than anything else, I think. I'd had a professional singing career. I forgot to mention earlier in life that I sang in an Episcopal boys choir at age about 10, and I was paid $3 a month. Unfortunately, my singing career ended when I became 13, and that was the end of my professional singing career. But I also had been an altar boy in the Episcopal Church, but hadn't really paid much attention to what I was being taught in the church. I think I was more inclined to be directed to religion based on the Scout Law, reverent, and that, to me, reverent meant attending church on a regular basis. Now, whether I was supposed to learn anything there or not, or get any concept of what my life should be based upon what my Heavenly Father wanted me to do, was not even in the picture at all. I was going through life, and until I was given the responsibility of determining my destiny and determining what my Heavenly Father wanted me to do on this earth, I'd never realized that was the situation. I just thought if you paid attention to what the minister said, you're going to turn out all right. And probably you do. An awful lot of people do turn out all right. But in terms of responsibility and who we are, that I'm actually a child of God, not just another guy that grew up in Connecticut, and it changed my life for good. And I think we've been in the church now for 46 years. I was 31, or close to that. I'm 78 now, so it's been quite a long time. Well, this 20 years they've given me on my life has been a great deal, because it means, I usually reach many of my goals. My goal is to outdo them, make them wrong. So that's going to take me to around 99. Yeah, I'm closer to death than I am to. And I've had cancer for quite a long time, on chemotherapy a couple of times, and actually 3 times. And but it doesn't slow me down. I've been fortunate. I have a chronic thing that is more of a blood problem. Leukemia is a blood disorder, and I'm short on platelets, and I've got too many mutated white blood cells. But so far, it hasn't caused much fatigue. Most of my problems are due to what I did to my body for too many years. But I'm closer to the other side. I certainly have 4 wonderful daughters, and I have a lot of fine grandchildren, and I have 4 great-grandchildren already, and another one coming along. And I've been married 55 years, so having stuck to marriage for 55 years, and I've actually known my wife since 1954, so I'm already past the 60-year mark in that regard. But I've been very interested in family history. I'm absolutely convinced that my reason for being a member of the church is because someone from the other side directed the missionaries to our house. And then use the Spirit to convince me that church was the place I should be. And that certainly in my mind is I am doing what I should be doing in this life. But I'm a very, very avid genealogist. I work extremely hard at genealogy. I've gathered far too much information. My biggest task for the rest of my life is to try to get it disseminated properly. I have a website, a Whittlesey website, but I just come back from Ireland here a few weeks ago, and I found all kinds of things on my Irish side that people need to know about. I just sent a packet, wrote a letter to my daughter Elizabeth, our youngest daughter who lives in New York City. And by the way, my children's names are Sarah, Anne, Margaret, and Elizabeth. And 3 of them are married, Elizabeth is not. But I sent her a packet about our Irish family, these many things that I found while I was in Ireland that extend our family back 4 or 5 more generations, and with some very, very interesting people. So I've gathered all this stuff, and I've got a whole office of them. One of the things that happens when you're born in New England, there's certain genetic maladies, or not really maladies, but things that happen to people who grow up in New England, is because New Englanders save everything. You don't throw anything away. And if you grew up during the Second World War, you didn't throw anything away. So years ago, I coined a word. I don't see it, it hasn't gotten to the dictionary yet, but it really should be in the dictionary, and I call it pack-rat-ism. We're all pack-rats. I have an office so full of papers. I have thousands and thousands of papers about family members and stories to pass on to people. And so that's the legacy. I published a genealogy in 1992 that has 896 pages in it, and over 16,000 people indexed, and I didn't even index the husbands and wives of the spouses. So I figure there's probably well over 20,000 people in the genealogy. And that alone is a legacy in a sense. It's a work, and it continues to grow. I mean, I have a lot more than that now on the website, but it's a form of a legacy. And I have hardworking daughters. They've followed my example of being an extremely hard worker all my life. Some of the things that I haven't done very well is I've kind of ignored some other familial responsibilities. I don't think I've treated my wife as well as I should have throughout our life together. No, I'm not too sure of that. But anyway, there's still things I need to work on. And fortunately, I've still got the mental desire to improve. It's a beautiful opportunity. This life is to just continually be looking for opportunities to grow in not so much materially, because I don't need to do any of that, but spiritually, and those things that will leave a lasting impression. There's still time, and you should never give up, because you can always improve. You can always get better in life. I'm going to do mostly family history, and I do some fly fishing. I tie flies. I'm a trout fisherman. I'm a catch and release trout fisherman, and I tie quite a few trout flies because it's a challenge. For me, it's a challenge. It's fun to be out there and have something. First of all, you're out in nature. I fish off a pontoon boat. It has an electric motor, but you use mostly your flippers and move yourself around the water and the lake by casting and retrieving or trolling and trying to select the right flies. So there's always questions as to what's right for that day, or why am I not catching as many fish as I should. There's certainly a lot of them. That's probably one of the things that my wife doesn't like as much, but my life has changed a lot because we've lived in the same place now for 33 years. And prior to that, it was 2 years at a time most everywhere. So life does change. But I still enjoy learning new things and just being challenged to continue to work hard in life and not just sit back and relax. I'd like to run some more marathons. I haven't run one since the early 1990s, but I'd like to think I could still get fit. I doubt that I can, But I'd like to think that one of these days I just got to commit myself to getting my muscles in better tune, and maybe I wouldn't hurt as much if I was in better shape. So, oh boy, I hadn't given that any real thought. I guess I would say, in some way, just say he was very fortunate to have a wonderful family, wonderful wife, and somehow worded that those around me really made my life what it is. I'm not too sure exactly what I would put on a tombstone. I actually had not given that any thought, and I probably need to at some point. His life was filled with numerous blessings. Numerous and sundry blessings. I don't know whether sundry is the right word, but I've had a very lucky life and a very good life. I've had exposure to many, many things. I mean, you mentioned Moby Dick. J. Ross Brown, my great-great-grandfather, wrote Etchings of a Whaling Cruise before Moby Dick was written, and Herman Melville said that he got most of his descriptions for the writing of Moby Dick from J. Ross Brown's book, Etchings of a Whaling Cruise. So one of my ancestors was involved in that same time frame. In fact, J. Ross Brown named one of his children Herman Melville Brown. So they were really close friends. And so they both were writers in that 1840 to 1870 time frame. He was also a friend of Mark Twain. So exposures to things like that just broadens your respect for my ancestors, the people that have contributed genes to my life. So I've just been blessed to have, I guess more than anything else, great genes. You know, although I may be being a bit facetious about living to fulfill the 20 years promised me in with the required minimum distribution of an IRA, I've been telling my oncologist, I've had this leukemia since 1998, and I started going to the having the Huntsman cancer people in 2001. I've been telling all my oncologists not to worry about it. I'm not worried about it, even though my blood results are not good. I'm going to outlive my grandfather, who was 91. And I've had most of the oncologists who say, that's probably going to do you more good than anything else, is a proper attitude toward continuing to do what you've evidently been tasked to do in this life, whether I'm the one who selected the tasks or whether they were put in front of me and I selected them and wanted to run with them, such as joining the church. They've certainly enhanced my life a great deal, as have my children and my wife, and my friends particularly. I mean, to live where I've lived for 30 years, you meet some really pretty wonderful people. And the more examples you have around you to guide you through this life and the things that you can do, I think the happier your life is. I think you have to, in order to keep happy and satisfied with your life, you have to be pleased with it. And that's one thing I've been throughout my life. Not pleased with some of my actions, but certainly pleased with the way my life has gone. I've got a great story that Mark Twain has written that I've read over and over and over again. I don't know how I'm going to go in heaven. I'm going in an anticipation of meeting all these people that I have, in a sense, known in one way or another, and with great anticipation of being with family and friends. And some of the people that I can apologize to for not having rectified issues before they left. But I don't know whether it'll be, it'd be lovely to be on an Atlantic 1 design that I crewed in some regattas on and stuff like that. But I don't know exactly what the mechanism will be. with open eyes and an open mind, and
So you can say that for him, say, I'm gonna go to heaven either on my old sloop that I built, or, I mean, what would your dream be as you go in?
wow. I guess my dream would be to be able to be guided into heaven by someone who's already preceded me, hand in hand with probably my grandfather. I think that's probably somebody close to me. I wouldn't like to pick which one, but I think I appreciated my grandfather Whittlesey as much as anybody in my life. Well, I don't think spiritually there's that much of a separation, but there definitely is. They lived in a different time frame, and they lived under much more difficult conditions. Maybe not more difficult challenges, but certainly more difficult conditions from a health standpoint and a subsistence standpoint. But I think as I've looked back through my ancestors and read about them, I'm absolutely amazed at what a high percentage of them declare their Christianity, their belief in Jesus Christ. And many, many, many of them in my lineage were of that mind. And I think that's a good lesson for me, because they were guided through their tough times with that knowledge and which they worked hard for.
So tell me, to finish this sentence for me, my tough times have been guided by.
Well, I think my tough times have been guided by the Spirit telling me when I've been making mistakes and how to get over and rectify the mistakes, and appreciating the fact that the hardest thing to learn in this life is to be humble enough to understand that the mistakes we make are for our own good. Some of the ones I've made have been in relationship to my wife over and over again, making mistakes in terms of our relationship, and being smart enough in many cases to not be so stubborn that I'm not willing to make amends for those, and be directed through the repentance process to try to improve. It's occurred too often in my life. It bothers me a bit that I don't learn more thoroughly some things, but the fact is the many chances I've been given to correct things is just, I've come to realize it's part of my life. It's part of improving my life. And I think I'm making progress. I certainly hope I'm making progress. I have a much greater desire at my age now to be on a good spiritual level, and feel that I'm guided by making proper decisions in that regard, and recognizing quickly when the Spirit is dissatisfied with me, to make amends for those, because it's not fun having that awakening too often. It's better to have a month or two go by when you think, I've done better last month. I've done better. And I can tell you right now, at my age, a month goes by, and my 3 weeks worth of pill boxes that I fill every so often, they only last 8 days now. I don't know how they take away 13 days from me every 3 weeks, but it seems to me I refill my 3 weeks worth of pill boxes every 8 days. They just go by. My great family, I would guess, if they're going to be aboard. My great family and friends. I'd love to be able to describe it better, but the friends and family that I've been able to either correspond with or meet during my lifetime, and it's many. I've had over 1,000 on a mailing list when I was doing the Whittlesey genealogy, and I have about 500 on my email mailing list now. And I have all those people that we knew in Rhodesia and South Africa. I didn't mention that I lived down there for 8 years in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and I played on the Rhodesian national baseball team for 4 years while I was living there. Played some international baseball competition, and had some have made wonderful friends pretty much everywhere we've ever been. And I think that's based upon my upbringing. My families were very, very outgoing, and it was a blessing. It's been a blessing to have that many friends and people supporting you throughout your life and putting up with you, too. Oh, yeah, I could count them quickly. I guess I started out living in Goshen, Connecticut, New York City, West Hartford, Connecticut. Then I spent 4 years in Massachusetts and 4 years in Annapolis, Maryland, where the majority of my time was spent there. Then I lived in, Judy and I lived in Farmington, Connecticut, West Hartford, Connecticut, Greens Farms, Connecticut, Greenfield Hill in Fairfield, Connecticut, Fairfield, Connecticut, Hancock, New Hampshire, Canterbury, New Hampshire, Maple Rain, Rhodesia, Salisbury, Rhodesia, Norton, Rhodesia, Palabora, northeastern Transvaal, South Africa, back to Salisbury, Rhodesia, and back to Palabora for 2 years there, Tooele, Utah, and Holiday, Utah. And we've been in Holiday, Utah since 1981. So all the rest of those places, if you could have numbered all of those places, I don't think there wasn't, I'm not too sure there was one of them that exceeded 2 years. Some of them were garage apartments when we were first married. And a child would come along and we'd move to a different one, but we lived a lot of places. When I leave, goodbye, because she'll be waiting for me on the other side. You know, I hope she'll say it's been wonderful. Plenty of times that haven't been wonderful. I spent too much time away from home. One of the real regrets, if we're supposed to even think about regrets, because there's something that you can't rectify other than maybe going overboard in a different direction, but is that I spent far too much time away from home, and she wound up raising our daughters, and that was bad. That was bad, and I missed a lot of the growing up of some of our grandchildren because I was gone so much of the time. One year I was 245 nights in motels, and that's probably not as much as that year in Russia where I was 8 weeks on and 2 weeks off. I did that for an entire year. And then another time I worked at a lead zinc mine in Alaska, and I was 4 weeks on and 2 weeks off for a little over a year. So I was gone all the time, and she did an outstanding job. We've got 4 great daughters, and they're all accomplished in one way or another, and we love them, you know, and I think they still love us. I believe they do. I see them. When they do, they tell me they do. And I hope it's not out of obligation.